Welcome to Fostering Voices. This is Chris,
And Hey.
and we are with our lovely, lovely guest, Davey Jones.
Yay, Davey.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. No one's described me as lovely before, so
You are seriously
a
probably
little
one of the most lovely
disorienting for me.
I know.
Thanks.
Accurate.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, so this is going to be episode 99. So we're so excited to have you as our 99th interview / just episode.
Mhm.
And this one will be a little bit different because we're actually not going to specifically talk about foster care or adoption, but if it comes up, we'll talk about it.
Yep.
But Davey is a friend of ours through work, through Show It, who is a proud sponsor of our podcast. So we're super thankful for them. But I met Davey through Show It. And actually, I think the first time I officially met you, there was a marketing offsite meeting that we did in Tennessee.
Yeah, was that the first time?
I think I might have met you briefly at United right before that, but like United is so crazy.
Yeah, it was definitely that. It was definitely that season for sure.
Yeah.
So it was either United or at the offsite.
Yep. And so the offsite was, 2 or 3 days of talking about marketing, which is funny that I would be on a marketing team because like I have no background in that, which is great. But I get to be on the marketing team / our community team. And so Todd had invited you out because you are a marketing guru, right, baby?
I don't know about that.
Well, you are.
I don't know about that. But I do a lot of it. I mean, both for Davey and Krista, that's my role. And then for Till Agency, that's my role as well.
Yeah. And what is Till Agency?
Paid advertising agency. So we do primarily Facebook ads, Google ads, any sort of paid channel.
Awesome. And so you do Show It, which is fantastic.
Yep.
And so you and your wife, Krista, who is not with us because she's watching your child. So we're sad that she couldn't join us because we were planning on doing a 4 people Zoom call here, but she is a website designer, and
Yep.
You guys have a shop where you guys have like tons of templates for websites, for WordPress and Show It, and then also you guys sell a lot of other business type things on there, right?
Yep. No, that's right. So it's primarily website templates for Show It and WordPress. And then we have a few other resources that are business related as well, but primarily websites.
Yeah. And your templates are incredible. And we are the lucky recipients of a Davey and Krista brand new podcast template.
It's
Yep.
amazing.
It's super
Thank you. I
incredible.
appreciate that.
Yeah. I had a dream of wanting a Davey and Krista website. But for those who don't know, we make $0 off of this podcast. It is a labor of love.
Mm-hmm.
And so like we have spent a ton of money on it, and we'll get into that because today's episode is talking about how to run a podcast and how to start one and how to keep it going. And it doesn't have to be expensive, but of course we just sometimes fall into
We
these
make some
things.
mistakes, no big deal.
It's fine.
And so real quick, just to jump on that, because the first time I met you, I had heard all of these stories. I just hear stories from GA. I don't know who people are because I'm not in that creative atmosphere, I guess, as much. And so, but I had heard all these stories about Davey and Krista and how great they are. And you're not really saying it as much, but you're a really big deal.
You're a big deal.
I've heard that from many people.
True.
And then the first time I met you was at United a few years back. And leaving that, I told you, hey, he is such a lovely man. So that's where the intro comes from.
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I appreciate that. That's super kind of you all.
Absolutely. And so you and Krista also have a podcast, and it's called
Yep.
Brands That Book Podcast.
Yep, that's right. So Brands That Book, primarily, so it is, it falls under the umbrella of Davey and Krista. So if you go to daveyandkrista.com, that's where you would find more information about the podcast. And it's Brands That Book, primarily targeting service-based businesses. So we're talking about, as opposed to, more e-commerce businesses, so online businesses selling shops and things like that, actually have a second podcast in the works for my other business, Till Agency, which I run with 2 friends of mine, Jesse Marquecho and Ryan Akins, where we will get more into kind of the e-commerce online business side of things. But Brands That Book focusing on service-based businesses like photographers, planners, a lot of wedding industry guests. So yeah, that is, and it's pretty much me each week. I can't convince Krista to come on regularly. Krista in nearly 90 episodes has been on like twice. So
So funny.
yeah, maybe I need you all to peer pressure a little bit. She was originally holding out for episode 100. And I was like, you have to be on the podcast before that. But, so I finally convinced her to. But yeah, on a weekly basis, it's, people are stuck with me.
No, it's so good. And even before you did the Brands That Book podcast, you and Krista and some friends, Natalie Frank and her husband, you guys co-founded the Rising Tide Society, which is super huge, a massive blessing to the entire creative space. And so you guys are big community proponents, and you guys just cheer people on. And I just feel like that is your heart for creatives and for businesses. And so I think that's such a great thing that like shines through every business that you do, that you just care for people and you care well for them and generously for them, which is why we get to have on your podcast templates. But just even your time today, spending time talking about podcasts with us and our audience, we're super thankful for that.
Yeah, well, like I said, thank you for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And, I'd say that as far as marketing goes, a lot of kind of the best, I guess, tips for marketing that I've picked up are really just through building relationships and what that looks like. And, I think that's really what marketing is, right? Is, building relationships with a customer or a client. So definitely big on community.
Yep, love that.
And you all host, the Show It hosts the Tuesdays together for the Phoenix area, right?
We have a lot of Show It tiers. There are Show It users. Almost all of them in the Phoenix area. I think there's 4 groups. They're almost all led by Show It users. So even
awesome.
Particularly like specifically host one, I do go to the East Valley one, and so that's fun. But there's so many Show It users in there, so that's awesome.
Cool. Yeah.
So let's dive into this thing of how to start a podcast. And I would say the number one thing that you should figure out is like, why do you want to have a podcast, right? And so like, is it relevant and helpful to other people, to the people who are going to listen? I always joke that like my sister and I should have a podcast because like we have the most hilarious conversations. But the only problem is no one would listen to it because it would be all nonsense and it would just be her and I cackling like fools, and like it wouldn't contribute anything to the world. And we were just talking about this with our kids today. Like people who want to be famous just for the sake of being famous, they don't make it anywhere because like they have nothing to actually contribute to the world. We don't need to get into the Kardashians, but like what are you bringing out into the universe? And so I would say like, first and foremost, like, why do you want to have a podcast? Like, what is the message that you want to share? And so, like, for you, your podcast is so specifically Brands That Book, right? Like, it's the basis of all of your episodes and the kind of information you guys are giving. And for us, obviously, being a foster care and adoption podcast, like, we specifically talk about foster care and adoption.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I would agree. That's a one of the first things that you want to figure out as you start your podcast, that and, format and how you want to set it up and whether it's going to be more, discussion, conversation based like this. But, even within running a business and running a business online and marketing, there's lots of different niches. And so for us, we just thought it was important to sort of focus in on a particular niche and really speak to a specific contingent of people where things are going to really resonate with them rather than just kind of keep it generic, business advice in general. And I think that's worked out. So I would definitely say niche down because you're going to, I think that's going to help you build momentum, is really connecting strongly with maybe a smaller group of people at first. But those are the people that are going to go to their friends and say, hey, you have to check out this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think it's easy when you're starting off to like get lost in the all of the like details, the
Mhm.
nitty gritties of like, oh, what am I gonna call it? And do I need to have intro music? And we are at, episode 99 with you, and we have no intro music. Like for me,
Yeah.
honestly, getting started, that was a massive hurdle that I just couldn't jump over for a really long time. I was like, what kind of intro music should we have? And like, where do I find this royalty-free music? And then finally I was like, screw it. Like we're not having an intro. Like every week you hear this hot guy saying,
That's right.
welcome to the Fostering Voices
Yeah,
podcast.
I've got it down though. But it took me about 97 episodes, but now I've got it.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you figured that out before I came on. So appreciated the but it's funny too what sorts of things really hold us up,
Yep.
like you maybe make out intro music to be the big thing that you have
Right.
to have in place before you launch, and that's not the case. And I certainly think that's true of equipment, right? Is okay, well, what kind of equipment, because you can get setups that cost thousands of dollars, right?
Absolutely.
Or if you have your computer or a phone, you can just record into that.
Yeah.
And if it's a matter of getting started versus not getting started, you should definitely just get started. So I definitely have, similar stories to, as we're getting started, what, I feel like we need to have, XYZ in place. And really it almost never has to be in place before you get started.
So kind of walk us through you as you started your podcast. What was the reason for starting it? And then what were the steps that you took to put it into place?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reasons I wanted to get started with a podcast was because I really like conversations with people. To a certain extent, I think just talking out an idea with somebody really helps me distill, whatever topic that I'm thinking of into, I guess, advice and strategy and tips that can actually be implemented. And I really like connecting with other people as well. So um, it's not, I think, unusual when I'm with my friends to start talking maybe something related to business. And I always sort of thought, I wish people could hear this conversation. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to start the podcast. And podcasts, even though more and more people are starting them, they're just not as ubiquitous as blogs are, and I still love blogging. I still like, putting out blog content on a weekly basis. But certainly more people blog than podcast. So
Absolutely.
I think that there's opportunity there, and still now today. And kind of like what you alluded to, people get hung up on maybe some of the technical components of podcasting, but I think it's because there's far less podcasts out there, it's a lot easier maybe of a platform to build an audience on. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to do a podcast as well. And then one of the sort of personal reasons was I wanted to ask better questions. That was kind of one of the goals in starting the podcast, and also taking on sort of the interview style. And I think that, just how people learn is through asking questions. And I think that, people who learn well are asking better questions. So sort of a personal reason for getting started with the podcast. And I think it's paid off.
Very cool. Yeah, you're a good question asker. So fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think your last two United Talks revolved around asking the right questions. So that's really funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think questions is powerful in terms of framing a conversation and learning about a subject. And based on how you ask the question, you allow for certain kinds of answers. So it really, I think to a certain extent important to ask the right questions as you're getting started with something. So sort of a nerdy reason, I guess, to get into podcasting, but it's had all sorts of benefit on the business. Like I said, I mean, just in terms of platforms, when you're searching for, and I'm sure this is probably true of fostering voices, is when people are looking for foster care resources, I can't imagine that there's as many podcasts about that topic as there are, let's say, blogs. Would that be true?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are a good number of podcasts out there about foster care.
Sure.
And I would say we are among the ones that actually have consistently been putting out podcasts. So I would say a couple that I listen to are a little bit more sporadic. But for the ones who are foster parents like myself, like I get it, like that you're like, hey, I'm putting out this podcast. Oh my gosh, we just got a placement. Oh, it's taking over my life. I got to take a hot break here for a second. So
Yeah, sure.
I understand why those podcasts function that the way that they do. But it's interesting, what you were saying about the blogging space versus the podcasting one. I talked to friends and we were like, oh, how do we get this like message of foster care out more? And for the most part, like foster parents aren't sitting at their computers all day reading blog articles. I mean,
Sure.
if you can on occasion open up your phone and find one that's relevant to an issue that you're having, then fantastic. But like,
They're just surviving.
they're surviving, and like I don't have a lot of time to sit and read blogs about parenting or foster care. And so we were like, man, this actually makes sense for the audience that we're trying to reach, and busy parents on the run. And it came in a season 2 where Chris and I were reading a lot more Audible books and starting to listen to podcasts. And I was like, man, this is so easy. Like we are getting a lot done. We're commuting, we're doing dishes or laundry or whatever, and we're still like putting information into our minds via, podcasts and books. So it just made sense for us at that time too.
Yeah, and I think the same has been true for my podcast. Is something I've seen is some people just prefer to consume audio content while they go for a run or whatever while they're commuting. I've actually seen a little bit of a dip in numbers during the pandemic here. Because and I think it might be because everybody's at home. And so people aren't on their normal commute. Maybe they're not getting outside as much, but it's allowed me to connect, I think, with a whole contingent of people who were just never going to sit down at a computer and read a blog post. And one thing that we've been doing is as we send out a weekly email, and typically it has the blog post version of the topic and then the podcast version. And I got away from sending, I ran a few tests where I would just send one or the other, and I had people respond almost immediately, and I wasn't expecting it, saying, hey, I really love that you send out both because I prefer, this version. So I think it was just encouraging for me to see, because I was like, okay, so it's worth actually disseminating this information through both channels, because a large contingent of people, actually would prefer listening to this rather than reading the blog post.
Yeah. No, and that's good. And for us too, like having, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but having a website and a blog that goes with our podcast. I mean, you can start and do without it. And the podcast hosts that you choose, there are spaces where you basically write show notes or whatever you want that to look like. And for us, we just want that to also be a resource place where people can either find us there first on our blogs that go with the website or with the podcast episode, or vice versa, where we talked about something and they're like, oh man, what was that book that they talked about? Because we do a lot of like book reviews. And so that's just a place where people can find the information. So it is nice to have both options.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think both options are necessary. Like I said, I like to write, and I think that for me, especially if I am doing a solo episode, or Vanessa Kynes, who is a Pinterest wizard, who actually, I think she's done some stuff with Show It Right. She was at United last year and taught. But anyway, so she'll come on as sort of a co-host with me occasionally, and it's helpful for me to sometimes write stuff out before jumping on the episode. But what do you all use to host your website? I mean, I'm sorry, not host your website, host your podcast.
So we use Libsyn. What do you
cool.
use?
We are using Fireside, so fireside.fm. But for anybody interested in getting started with a podcast, that's one of the things that you'll have to choose. Do you like Libsyn?
I do like Libsyn. So it's super funny. Elisa Watson started a podcast before we did. I feel like we do a lot of stuff right after them, but that's fine.
Not that we're copying them or anything. So it's just coincidental.
Exactly. Super coincidental. So Elisa started a podcast and she was using Blueberry, which is BLUBRY or something like that. Anyways, all these things will be in the show notes. But I started using Blueberry and I couldn't find, so this is something that you'll have to do when you are setting up your podcast, is finding a podcast host. And so she used Blueberry and she said, oh, it's super easy. She even showed me how it kind of worked. And I was like, oh yeah, that is really easy to use. But then there's this one tiny thing that you have to do in order to connect your podcast host to iTunes, which is obviously very important if you want to be a podcast that other people can find. And so it was finding your RSS feed URL to put into iTunes. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I work for a website company, but like when I hear too many acronyms, I just shut down.
No good.
Like I just start crying in the corner. I'm sure Todd's super impressed by that still. It's been like 4 years that I've worked for Show It. So I was like, I'm sorry, RS what? And why, what are you asking me? And so I had the hardest time finding the RSS link thing to put into the iTunes. So I legit just jumped ship and I left Blueberry and I like Googled I Googled how to find your RSS feed on Libsyn and a thing popped up. I was like, okay, like it just walked you through it. And that was legitimately the reason why I picked Libsyn, because like I Googled it and an article popped up right away and it seemed easy enough. And so.
Yeah. I know it's one of the more popular hosts. I really like Fireside, and I would highly recommend it to somebody who doesn't want to deal with a lot of technical stuff. I feel like it's a very straightforward platform. And I thought that the way they kind of lay out getting started was like really intuitive. And I know I don't know if this is true of Libsyn, but like for instance, getting your podcast on Spotify or some of these other channels, occasionally you have to go straight to those other channels to do so. With Fireside, you can take care of all of it within Fireside. So if you go to Fireside and you get all set up, it's going to ask for a bunch of information. You'll plug that in, and then it will, automatically disseminate your podcast to all these different channels, whether it be Spotify or Overcast or iTunes. And then I think really the only other thing that people have to kind of set up in terms of making sure their podcast gets on iTunes is going through iTunes Connect.
For sure.
Right. And then selecting podcast. And I know this, if you're listening, this is a lot. But basically Fireside is the host, and then selecting something like, or going and getting set up on iTunes Connect. And if you just Google iTunes Connect, you'll find that information. And then Fireside will walk you through exactly how you get set up on iTunes Connect and how you use that information. But that should get your podcast pretty much everywhere.
For sure. Yeah. And Libsyn does that as well. So
that's great.
We're thankful for that it goes out to Spotify and I don't know, all the other different Google Play or something for people who don't have iPhones. And so there's a lot of other options, which is nice because that wasn't something I thought about in the beginning, but it was nice that it was already there.
And it also helps, it helps magnify how easy it is.
Oh, for sure.
That we have no clue what we're doing.
Totally.
And we got it up and running.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a major check mark for Libsyn for sure. How much do you pay? I imagine yours. I don't know.
It's like $19 a month for Fireside. Is that what?
I think that's about.
Ours is like 17,
18 somewhere.
And I would say too, something to consider when you're starting a podcast and you're like, I'm probably not making any money off of this, especially if it's like a hobby podcast or whatever have you. And you're like, this is not a moneymaker at this point. You can start small. And so I think we started off with like the smallest package that Libsyn offered, which was like $7 a month. But what you're paying for is like storage space.
Yeah.
And so at first, when I think our first episode was like 20 minutes maybe, and then our second episode was like 20 minutes, and then the third one was a bit longer, and they're like, okay, you're basically out of storage space for the month. And so we had to amp up to the next tier of, storage space that they had. But that's the nice thing. Like you can start off small. Like you don't have to jump into the $20 a month commitment or whatever have you. And I'm sure there are other podcast hosts that are free even. I had a friend who basically did her podcast entirely on her phone.
Yeah.
And I think the app that she used was called like Anchor FM or something. And like she just
I've heard of Anchor.
On her phone, edited it on her phone, and uploaded it right into that app and then shot it out. I've never used it, so I don't have a lot of experience with that. But she put out a good number of episodes and they sounded great. So if you want to check that out, it's called Follow the Friends. But yeah, it was interesting to see that like you can seriously do a podcast and still have it sound good for very, very little money.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. With
And-
Fireside, they don't have that storage option. So the upside is that you get unlimited storage with Fireside.
Okay.
But it sounds like the downside is, you're going to pay $19 a month, regardless of whether you have one episode up or whether you have 150 episodes up. So, but if you are looking for something easy, I think it's at least worth checking out.
Yeah.
But Anchor sounds interesting too.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny, like, we'll get into equipment in a second because I want to hear the things that you have bought and used. But Chris and I have gone through a lot of mics.
Mhm.
And the other day we recorded an episode where a girlfriend came over and I had 3 mics out on the table and none of them worked. And I think I actually didn't turn on the mixer.
I usually do the
Just
mic
tech support.
setup,
Yeah, for sure.
and Jihei edits and
Does all that stuff.
Does that stuff.
Yeah,
That
but he
side of
wasn't
it.
here. And so I just totally bombed and I ruined this like opportunity to have a super great sounding podcast with all of our equipment that we spent a lot of money on. But then on my iPhone, I just found voice memo. And I've also heard people say that they just record their podcast on voice memo. And it was amazing. Like,
Sounded great.
it sounded good.
Yeah.
I'm going to say it didn't sound as good as when we had our mics because
Yeah.
I want to justify why we spent so much
Thank
money
you.
on mics. But it was clear and it was good. Like, iPhones are amazing. The pictures they take are amazing. And the sound
Yep.
quality that you're getting to even record professional sounding things, like, it's good.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
don't let that
And you
screw
can
up.
get, I think I have one here. I have to see it have the brand name on it. It's somewhere on my desk. My desk is a disaster. Fortunately, you all can't see that. But you can get like little lavalier mics that plug straight into your phone as well. And those aren't, I can't remember. I want to say like it was $30-ish or less, for something like that.
Oh.
And I don't use that on a regular basis, but the audio quality sounds great. So that's an option, especially if you're doing solo episodes
Yeah.
or in-person episodes, as you all do.
Mhm.
So, but I mean, I remember when I was looking at mics, I wanted like this really expensive mic to get started, which I actually have now. But Krista wouldn't let me get it at first. She was like, "Hey, you don't even like, what if you record 3 episodes and quit and hate this, which was a possibility, right?
Sure.
And
Or if
I
you buy
think
it
as
on
we talked
Amazon, you
about-
can return it.
Easy. Perfect.
Yeah.
Or at Costco.
Costco.
See, I wasn't wise enough to make any of these arguments early on. So we finally settled on a Yeti mic, which is a good mic.
We have one.
Yeah, it's a solid mic, and the great thing about the Yeti mic is it plugs straight. You guys got a cool color Yeti mic. I've
Well,
never
it's-
seen that. I've
It's
seen
funny because they're
black,
called Blue
white.
Yetis. And I think we thought that they only came in blue. And then I saw other people's. I'm like,
Yeah.
it comes in white? That's so
Yeah.
cute.
Yeah. So, but the Yeti mic is great and it plugs straight into your computer. And so it's super easy to use. Whereas like the setup now, this whole thing plugs into, so I'm using a Shure SM7B. I love telling people that this is the mic that Michael Jackson used to record Thriller.
Wow.
How cool
That's a
is
big
that?
deal.
Yes. Not this mic in
Congratulations,
particular, because that
You and Michael Jackson, same room.
because if Michael Jackson had actually used this specific mic, I would have never been able to afford it.
Sure.
But this hooks up into it's a cardioid mic, and so it hooks up into this whole setup that I have going that I had to get a more technical friend help me set up with. And honestly, I don't know if the jump in sound quality from just using your computer to the Yeti is pretty significant. But then from the Yeti to this, I don't know how significant it is. I don't know if anybody listening to the podcast for the first 80 something episodes, and since then has said, "Oh yeah, the sound quality sounds a lot better now."
Oh, for sure.
Nobody said that yet. So I definitely think, just in talking about getting started, it's best to get started lean.
Totally.
And if that might be no mic, that might be just an inexpensive mic off of Amazon. One of the reasons I was able to upgrade to this is because, we're starting to do some more video stuff. And then Krista ended up needing a mic. So I was able to get her my mic, and use that as an excuse to upgrade the mic that I use on a regular basis. So
Well
yeah.
done. I'm glad you got the mic of your dreams. That's hilarious.
Yeah. I have a couple friends who use it, and it does sound, I mean, when they were, so I'd record podcasts with them and it just sounded so good. So excited to have it.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because we also tried to set up our mics for the Zoom call, and you are actually our second Zoom call, but you're going to be the first one that we release. But I mean, I just can't get it figured out to like hook it back into the computer because we usually record on our mics that we got off of Amazon. It was like a podcasting package.
Yeah.
Right? It came with like 2 mics, headphones that don't always work properly for me. And then we bought this like mixer thing that you can record or plug in 4 mics. So sometimes we do up to 4 people at an interview. And yeah, I couldn't get it to work with Zoom, unfortunately. But normally when we're doing it in person, we'll record with all of that and just put it straight into Audacity, which is a program that's free, praise sweet Jesus. And so we use that and I edit on it. I edit all of our podcasts, and it takes me a hot minute to do just because I like to take out all the ums and the like lip smacking sounds because I find those.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine.
All the time.
Apparently if you drink water, then there's a lot less lip smacking, but that I would say goes more for like if you have the mic right up to your face. Like at this point, Davey's definitely going to sound way better than us today because he has his mic set up and we are using the mic.
One of the things that I like about this mic in particular is I feel like the Yeti picked up a lot more of the lip smacking and even some like sounds just around the mic. This one I think does a better job with it. It actually has a cover too that I could add to it to probably make it that much crisper. But now I'm thinking about our ums and lip smacking.
Sorry to distract you there. But yeah, like we've upped our mic game as we've gone on, but we're like in year 3 of podcasting. So like you're saying, like just start off small. Like don't feel like you have to get all of the things that professional podcasters use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've used the Yeti up until just a few, probably 10, 15 episodes ago. And then it, upgraded to this mic. And like I said, the excuse was we were doing some video stuff too, and we wanted to plug straight into the camera and yada, yada, yada. So I was able to finally convince Krista, hey, I've done this now for 80 episodes in 2 years. Like, it by all indications, I'm going to stick with this. So it made sense at that point. But I am grateful for somebody like her who's like, Davey, you don't need all the things right now just to get started. So definitely worth just getting started. As far as editing stuff goes too, I've never edited my own podcast. That would be one of the things that would hold me up from ever publishing a podcast episode. And I sort of knew that going into it. Like, if I was going to be able to do a podcast on a consistent basis, I wasn't going to be the one that was going to edit it. So I've had early on had an assistant edit it. And then we ended up sending that off to, there's a ton of services out there that will edit your podcast for you. So, I pay a service called We Edit Podcast to edit a certain amount of episodes for me a month. That is not the inexpensive way to do it. And again, like our podcast is a little bit different, right? In that, my podcast is for business. So to me, I see this as like, a business expense, right? And a marketing expense in order to get in front of more people. So somebody starting a podcast about foster care, right? That's not necessarily, there's not necessarily the return on an investment, at least monetarily, maybe to justify going that direction. But I don't know if you find this, it's hard for me to listen back to me. And then, editing.
We do it just so that we can say, yep, we said
I said 487 times in the first episode.
And it's one of those things where even after the episode's edited, I send it over to Krista and I'm like, hey, how does this sound? And I just need her to listen through the whole thing and be like, hey, it's fine. Like, we're going to, publish it or whatever. But the editing, that would definitely hold me up from doing it. But you can make it as, simple or, advanced as you want it to be. GarageBand for Mac users is free, something like that. And I know people who they record, they slap on their intro and outro, and then it's out there. And it doesn't matter, like, if there's a mess up in the middle of it, they just roll with it and have fun with it. And Again, I think just going back to this concept of getting started, that's totally fine,
Yeah.
especially if you don't have hours to put into editing the episodes. And
Totally.
I don't know if you all would agree with this, but to me, the editing is the one area that could take way longer than it should and really hold up kind of the
That's
publishing
where I live.
process.
I live in that space of like, why am I putting so much time into this? But I'm just, I don't know, I'm stuck. And I'm not even a perfectionist. Like Chris knows this, like I'm very, I don't know, laid back and maybe sometimes too laid back. But for whatever reason, with editing the podcast, I have to do it. So
yeah,
I don't know. Some weeks I'm a little bit more lax than others, but for the most part, if I can manage to do it, then I do it. And it's funny too, like having a sponsor now, you know, Todd has said like, hey, why don't you go ahead and get a podcast editor? And I'm like, oh, I don't know, like the kids walked in at this minute and I wrote it down and I'm sure I could pass those notes along to an editor. But again, those feel like extra steps to me at this point. So I'm like, I'll just do it. It's fine.
Yeah. So We Edit Podcast is pretty great. I mean, occasionally, so I take notes during the podcast and I'll say like minute 11, they're building a porch or a fence behind me, like right behind this wall here, you know, so you might hear a little bit of that. But if it got out of hand, I would write down, you know, minute 11 or whatever, but I don't have to give them a specific timestamp. And what I found is like things that I forget about and I just send off, they pretty much take care of it. So it is kind of nice. And I think, you know, having somebody else listen to it, even if you were just paying somebody like a friend who was, you know, looking maybe to do that kind of work, I think usually people can tell like, okay, I should probably that loud banging sound, I should edit out, you know?
That's true.
Yeah.
Do they have different levels or different tiers, I guess, for editing?
Yeah, they do. They have tiers from just like editing only to including, they'll even do like transcripts for you and show notes if you want. They have different, you know, numbers of episodes, like in terms of, I think I do 5 episodes a month with them. That's, I think, the plan that we're on. But you could, if you were publishing multiple times a week, you could do a different, you know, more customized plan with them. So I've been very happy with them. They're the only outside of doing it in-house, they're the only people that we've outsourced it to. And they've done nothing to make me think like, oh, I should look for another solution. So
great.
Yeah, they've been pretty good.
I would say another equipment piece that I kind of have gotten hung up on is the computer that you're using. And so we go through a gazillion computers. For probably the main reason is that we don't spend a ton of money on computers because we have all these kids and we know they're going to break at some point. So we started off with probably a PC of some sort, and then I got a MacBook. Like we got a refurbished MacBook, and
which is a great value, by the way.
Yeah, for sure. We're not buying a brand new Mac. I don't know. There are too many people out there who get brand new Macs that there's no reason for me to not get their old Mac, you know?
Yeah. And even if you can get a brand new refurbished Mac, I want to say for maybe 2/3 the cost of a, you know, whatever the brand new model is. So definitely if you're looking for a new computer, it's worth checking out.
Yeah, for sure. But then we ran an update one day on our Mac and we were using Audacity on the Mac. And then all of a sudden, run the update, Audacity doesn't work on Mac anymore. And I was like,
and it was just a little window, but it was a crucial window for us. It was like the last episodes
of like the
season
4 or something.
And Audacity hadn't run an update to be compatible with
Catalina, whatever.
Something. It was just this perfect storm.
It was insane. Like I brought my computer to work. And I work with a lot of very smart people, and I'm like, someone touch this and fix this, and they're like, you can't make it work. And I was like, oh my god, it's such a
did you like lose episodes from that, or lose like audio content?
Fortunately, we're not organized enough to be like, hey, oh man, I just lost like 10 episodes that we had pre-recorded. No, we are like usually fly by the seat of our pants.
Yeah.
Hey, we have to have an episode out in 2 days. We probably should record one today. When we have a guest, it obviously takes a lot more planning. And the fact that we're recording this right now and we're actually not releasing this episode specifically for another like 2-3 weeks, this is incredible.
We're doing great right now.
Yeah.
The best we've heard.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we had to get a different computer because then I tried to learn how to do GarageBand. But I'm an old dog who can't learn new tricks. And so I could not figure out GarageBand to save my life. I was like, we have to buy another computer. So we bought like an HP at Costco.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. It's what we're on right now. I would say their videos could definitely use some help, their camera, but it's fine. That is why I love podcasts. Like, we don't have to get dressed. We don't have to like look nice to sound okay. But we're trying something new and just doing.
Even with the Zoom, I'm not wearing any pants right now. There's no need.
That's right. Even with the video stuff, all you have to do is make sure that your top half
Just up
is
top.
Exactly.
no.
Just up top.
Yeah, for sure. So I don't use Zoom to record or Audacity. We use Call Recorder for Mac. So if you go to, I think it's an Ecamm software. So if you go to ECAMM, I think might even be ecamm.com. But if you just Google Ecamm, you'll be able to find it. Call Recorder for Mac. It works with Skype. I don't like Skype as a platform. I would much rather not use Skype.
Yeah.
But Call Recorder is great because what it will do is it will record you all specifically. It would record me, and then that way, when I export the files, I can export the files individually.
Mhm.
So, for instance, if you're talking and there's a ton of noise on my side, we could just use your audio track. So it just, in terms of the editing process, it just makes it a little bit easier to clean up areas that might not sound great. And the great thing about Ecamm is it is a one-time payment. I mean, they occasionally come out with updates, but I want to say,
It's like 40
well, I won't say,
or 40
yeah, it had somewhere in there. And of course, all of this kind of stuff adds up. But it is, I've used Zencaster before, which is another great option. There's no video component, which is hard because I think anytime you're having a discussion with somebody and you can't see them, it's hard to, sometimes you don't know where to pick up, where they're leaving off. I just think the conversation's a little bit better with the video aspect. But with Zencaster, you're paying somewhere between, I think, $10 or $20 a month.
Right.
So Ecamm definitely makes sense from that perspective, especially if you're looking for maybe a little bit more flexibility around the audio files that you're using when editing. But I mean, yeah, I think at the end of the day, podcasting requires less equipment than, let's say, video does. There's a lot. I think there's a lot more flexibility in terms of editing things out. If you do make a mistake and you are really conscious about that kind of stuff, whereas with video, it would be pretty clear usually. If you were to edit a large segment of the video out of the conversation, I think there's probably more flexibility with podcasting. So that's one of the reasons I've enjoyed podcasting. As far as other equipment goes, Fusebox is what we use for our player. So when we embed, if you go to our website and you look at any of our show notes, there's a player within the show notes. So you can listen to the episode right on our website. We use Fusebox now, in part because the Fireside player doesn't always format well depending on what device you're on our website. So that's one of the reasons we use Fusebox. Fusebox is another subscription. I want to say it's like $9 a month. And again, like, there are free options out there for that kind of thing. And you can get just raw HTML players that are going to be totally free and look fine for all of that. So I think everything we've probably mentioned today, there's a free a free option. So I can't think of any other equipment that I use.
Yeah, I would say those are the big things for sure. Mics, computer, mixer type things.
And the other thing to remember is your podcast is a professional podcast. So those are all the things that you have, which still aren't that much.
Right. That's true.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, at the end of the day, you can keep it pretty lean. Editing is the most expensive part of it, for sure. But a lot of the things that we use for the podcast are things that we used in other areas, like Ecamm. Those tools I was introduced to for a whole nother project, right? And so we were just able to kind of reappropriate things, and invest in things at different points when it made sense. And I was going to mention something else about that. I guess website is the other piece of that we could chat about.
Yeah.
But yeah, lost my thought.
That's okay. Actually, before we jump into websites, one other
Sure.
note that I wrote that something to consider when you're starting your podcast too is like when you're going to release it and how long your episodes are going to be. And I would say for us, I mean, we don't necessarily subscribe to like one thing. And so we try to keep our episodes on the shorter side, as in like a 20, 30-minute window.
We fail.
But we fail often. Yeah. And I haven't really gotten any complaints about it. And I don't see a major dip in our numbers when we have like an hour-long episode versus a 30-minute episode. And I would say same thing as you, like a lot of people listen to us while they're commuting. And so the fact that people aren't commuting anymore, we're like, let's try to keep them a little bit shorter. But especially when we interview like former foster youth or just people who have a long story, like we don't like cutting them off. And so some of our episodes are 2 hours and 1 hour. And we did record one recently this season where it was a 2-hour conversation. And that one we did break up into 2 1-hour segments. I mean, that's a lot to listen to, and I get that. But again, just like recognizing what your audience is looking for. And so for us, I do think people come wanting to hear some different stories, whether it's from foster parents, from foster youth, from adoptive parents or adoptees. Like we just try to have like a good range of people who are involved in all of those areas. And a lot of it is story. And so I think people like to hear that. And so I think for our audience, they are aware that like some weeks will be shorter than others, but some weeks are long, but at least the long ones, like they're good stories to listen to, you know?
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I don't think that there's a magic number. I think that people listen to stuff that they're interested in listening to. And I think one of the piece of advice that I'm glad that I ignored early on was, well, make sure it's only, 10 to 15-minute episodes because that's all people have an attention span for. And I just find that not to be the case. I definitely see anything over an hour. So we've had a couple episodes go over an hour, and I'd see in typically when they go that long, and you can see how long people stay tuned in. Through Fireside. I think iTunes even publishes like kind of the average amount of an episode that people consume. So anything over an hour and you start seeing it definitely dip off a little bit. But point being is, if somebody's interested in that topic, they're going to listen to it, and they're generally going to want more information than less. There's a couple people who produce podcasts whose content I really like, especially their written content, because it's pretty thorough. But then their podcast is 5 minutes long, and at the end of it, especially a topic that I'm interested in, I'm like, that there's nothing, they didn't go far enough into the content for me to learn anything. One of my favorite podcasts, the guy, he cuts it at 30 minutes. He's like pretty strict about that, with very few exceptions. And so he'll get occasionally at the end of 30 minutes and, he'll be interviewing somebody that's super interesting, or he'll be talking about something that's super interesting. And I'm always thinking like, why it seems so arbitrary. Like I would love for you to ask this guy 3 more questions.
That's funny.
So yeah, I would ignore. So it's actually the Council of Trent, which is a podcast on Catholic apologics. So, yeah, so sort of a nerdy.
Have a wide range of.
Yeah, that's so funny.
Yeah, absolutely.
A big topic that. Why are you stopping at 30 minutes?
Yeah.
Just keep going.
I'm the same way.
Yeah,
I'm absolutely the same way. Where I'll hear a podcast that is a friend of ours does 5-minute podcasts, which are great. But at the end of 5 minutes, I'm like, I want more. I definitely want more. And sometimes I'll find myself just I'll binge listen to a bunch of podcasts at a time. But when it's too short like that, and I want more content. I want them to go further.
Yeah.
Especially something that I'm very passionate or interested in. For me, it's not Catholic apologetics, although that's.
We'll check it out.
Yeah, I will totally check that out. But it would be financial stuff and things like that. Yeah. So
my favorite actually Catholic podcast is a podcast called Catholic Stuff You Should Know, and it's it's not like Catholic apologetics. It's actually these 3 or 4 priests who produce it, and it's I could get into why I like it all, but I'll spare you all that. One of the things though about that podcast is there's a ton of banter. So, it's not unusual for the first 15 minutes of, let's say, an hour-long episode to just be them talking about whatever,
Yeah.
and I really appreciate that. And it's funny, sometimes they'll kind of, how people read their mean tweets, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
They'll sometimes read kind of the mean reviews where people are like, I wish they'd
Oh,
just get
that's
to the
amazing.
topic. But, I think that what they have an understanding is like people who really like that podcast really like seeing sort of the dynamic of the relationship and just kind of their off the cuff thoughts of, whatever's going on that day.
Yeah.
So, I'm glad that they ignore those sorts of reviews. And just for anybody starting, like, people can leave reviews unsolicited on on iTunes, and I think it's beneficial for the most part to read them, but not necessarily to act on every
Right.
bad review, or even good review for that matter, and just kind of of course you want to figure out what your audience likes about your format, and build on that. But if you start changing up everything that somebody doesn't like, then you're going to constantly find yourself, I think, unhappy in producing any sort of content, whether it be podcast or something else. So
For sure. I feel like when we first met in Nashville, or when we were able to chat more, you introduced me to a couple of like marketing guys or like copywriting people that I hadn't heard of before. And so I started listening to their podcast. And it's really funny, like how small the circle of influence is in terms of like, I don't know, maybe in the marketing world, maybe other people don't know any of these people's names. But for me, like the Donald Miller and like all the people that he knows, like I listen to all of his friends' podcasts, or I used to more when I was driving places. But like, so I started listening to Ray Edwards, who is a copywriter, and he's just like this older Caucasian gentleman who is a very successful copywriter. And so I enjoyed listening to his podcast. And actually, he does, he has like a Bible verse of the day. And for me, like, we're Christian. Not everyone who listens has to be Christian in order to listen to us, and we don't want that to be the case. But it was really inspiring for me to hear this man who is like really big into marketing and copywriting, and he was like, but my faith is in Jesus, and so like I want people to know that, and I still talk about this on my podcast. And I was like, that's fantastic. Like I legitimately had a moment when we were starting the podcast of like, how much do we want to talk about the fact that we're Christian and that we love Jesus? And that he's the reason for all our seasons, like, and I was like, you know what, this guy's crushing it. Like, if people don't want to listen to us because we're Christian, then okay, that's fine. We don't want to shove it down people's throats, but like, it's a major part of who we are. And so we wanted to share that. And so like when we have a good word of the day, and I have guests who aren't even believers either, but it's still a place where you can share something that's inspirational to you. And so I hope that, that's a space where people can feel inspired, whether they're religious or not. But Ray Edwards for me was a big one. And so I listened to him, and then he had a friend too, Cliff Ravenscraft, and he's the podcast Answer Man. And I actually enjoyed his podcast in very small doses because I don't love his voice. And then sometimes his wife on, and that also wasn't my favorite. But they gave like really good basic tips on how to podcast. And I would say for me, one of the biggest piece of podcasting advices I got from them was like to be consistent. And just figuring out like, again, what does your audience want from you, and like how are you going to deliver it to them? And so they were like, even if you only podcast once a month and you say first Monday of the month, tune in, we are dropping it like it's hot, you will get a 20-minute 2-hour whatever podcast. And then actually showing up that first Monday of the month and like delivering awesome content to whoever's listening. And so for me, I was like, man, that is like, it was nice that it wasn't like this huge number, like, hey, make sure you have 3 episodes a week, and that you're just like shoving your podcast down people's throats, but that it was something that you could decide worked for you and for the audience that you're trying to reach, and then actually sticking to it. And so for us, for 2.5 years, I would say, we did episodes that came out every Saturday morning before 9 a.m. I tried. And then quarantine life happened, and I was like, I can't get these out on Saturdays anymore. And so we moved to Sundays. But honestly, we had a drop in our numbers when I stopped putting them out on Saturday mornings. And it's super funny too to see that people don't actually even listen to the episode that we put out that week. But we have a huge spike in like Saturday, we get a bunch of listeners, but they're not listening to the one we put out, but they are remembering that we put out an episode on Saturday, so they listen. And then whatever, they go on with their lives. But like when we moved to Sundays and I didn't announce that we were moving to Sundays, people just stopped listening for a while. And I was like, oh my gosh, like that was real advice. Like people want to know when you're going to do this thing that you said you're going to do, and then they'll show up for it. And so for us now, we've announced it a couple of times, hey, we're doing Sundays now. Join us on Sunday mornings. And I don't always have to put out a social media post about it. That always helps for sure. But people show up on Sundays now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we saw the same thing. We've been pretty consistent for the last 2 years. There's been a month, probably, it was one fall, not this past fall, maybe the fall prior, where we need to build up content again, because I do think if you let it go so that you're always just 1 week out, you're recording an episode and then having to publish that week, then it does feel a little like a little bit of a grind.
Oh yeah.
So we needed to stop, like press the brakes and record some content and just get ahead a little bit. But what we noticed is that when we came back, our numbers had dipped and it took a while to get back to where we were. And I've heard that from a number of different people. And so I think it's important, even just in letting people know, when we came back, people were like, oh, we got emails and it was like, oh, I'm glad you're pushing out content again. I thought you had just ended the podcast, so we're actually planning potentially of breaking a little bit again, maybe sometime this summer, in part just because I'm hoping that in the next couple months, we'll be able to spend more time outside of our homes, but, also just to kind of reevaluate the podcast a little bit. We're of course going to continue doing it, but I just want to revisit some things. But this time around, I will definitely say that the episodes leading up, like, hey, we're not going to publish, let's say maybe the month of July, but we will be back here in August. So just giving people a heads up too, I think goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. And for us too, we have this really arbitrary schedule that we've created for ourselves that works out great for like our kids' school schedules. And so we're 20 episodes on and we do 6 to 8 weeks off and then we come back for a 20. But for me, like, I feel like that's a race that we can run, even though we are in the season that you talked about. Like, it is a grind because a lot of weeks we're like, oh my gosh, we have to put something out this week. And again, we are trying to make sure that it's relevant, that people want to listen. It's not like we're just checking a box like, hey guys, we showed up. We have nothing interesting to talk about. Like, we're not trying to waste people's time. But just knowing that we have 20 episodes in a season and we are going to show up for 20 weeks in a row. And sure, like in the event of an emergency, yes, we've taken, I think, 1 week off in a 20-week span. But like, it's nice to know, like at the end of that 20 weeks, we're taking 6 to 8 weeks off. And I always say, oh, we're going to work on our website. We're going to still, be up on our social media. And I just kind of die in those seasons and just rest, which I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. But just having even rest built into your podcast season,
Yeah, I sometimes wish I'd went the season route, just because I do feel like there's, you could say, hey, I'm gonna publish this by seasons. There's gonna be 10 episodes in a season, and then you're gonna take a 3 or 4 week break in between, or whatever you want it to be. Whereas, the way that we currently have it set up is just people expect content every Wednesday morning, so indefinitely.
Well, you can say, hey, our season is 100 episodes long.
That's right. Season 1, 100 episodes long.
And we'll be back. Right. So you still have, you have room to pivot. And I think for me, that's a piece of advice I would give people is like, you have room to pivot, like in any area of your life, like you're going a certain way. And I think Bob Goff talks about this so much and it's cute how he mentions it, but like you can be doing something good and it's working. But at some point you might just need to do like a 15-degree turn and just pivot a little bit. And that's fine. Like whether you're growing and so you have to add more to your podcasting, platform, or things get too busy in your life and you're like, you know what, we're scaling back. We used to do this every week. Life has changed a bit. We're just doing this every other week. And when you announce things and like communicate them, I think, people respond to that, but not feeling trapped by the own, again, arbitrary things that we've created for ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I hope that this has been helpful in terms of equipment and format. I don't know if you all have any more questions around how things are structured on the podcast.
No, I think we covered a lot today,
yeah, we
which
did.
Is good.
Yeah.
The big piece that I just want to hit on real quick is, you alluded to it earlier, is the website.
Yes.
And we already talked about the template that you guys have created, specifically geared towards podcasters. So we're hoping to have ours up
by the time
this episode airs.
Yeah. And I would say the best part of your template that you've created and that people can buy at your shop, is it up already on your shop? Okay.
Yeah, it's already up. It's available on Show It.
I love
Very
it.
well.
And the best part, I would say, of that website is the fact that you can leave an iTunes review within that website.
Yeah.
And so I was showing Chris, like, hey, this is what the template that they sent over. And he's like, oh my gosh, I didn't really realize why you were so excited that Davey and Krista were making something
I
for us.
usually don't geek out over all this stuff. Like, gee, when I looked at it, I was like, this is much more pleasant to look at. You were right.
Well, I can take no credit for any of that because that's all Krista. She's the designer of the two of us. You know, my job is just to market stuff.
Yeah.
Take some credit.
Yeah.
But yeah, incredible.
No,
very talented.
Yeah.
I was excited to see it, and we actually started building in some of the components that she built out for that template into our website. I feel like whenever she designs a template, I'm like, oh, I really like that. We need to, we need to include some of this on our website. We have one of our team members, he just started a podcast with his wife, and they're using a lot of the components of the template as well. But one of the things that was such a struggle for me in getting started with podcasting was you don't really own the platform as much as you do when you're publishing blog content, let's say on your website.
Yeah.
I don't know if people feel the same way about YouTube. We don't do a ton of stuff on YouTube, even though we publish videos there. But I'd say 80% of our downloads, I was just actually looking before this. So around 80% of our downloads come from iTunes or, Apple Podcasts, that channel, which is great. I mean, it's great that Apple has created a channel that a lot of people use for, to consume podcasts. But unlike somebody, let's say, going to our website and reading a blog post and us being able to maybe control the experience a little bit, whether that's like maybe getting them to other content that we want to see. I feel like there's not as much flexibility, when somebody's listening to, let's say they subscribed on iTunes and that's how they consume your podcast. You can say, hey, head on over to the show notes or head on over to, your website, but there's no guarantee that somebody will. And kind of like we were talking about earlier, my guess is a lot of people are listening to the episode while they're running or working out or, in the car. So it's not like they're pulling up their phone and heading on over to your website. So, but with that said, it's beneficial, I think, to have one. And I think more and more understood the value of something like show notes, because, like even in an episode like this, we talked about a lot of different stuff. And show notes give you an opportunity to send people to, your website to figure out, okay, exactly what were these resources that we were talking about. And then you all can do whatever you want from there. Maybe that's getting people to sign up to your email list, or maybe that's affiliate links, for people who are doing affiliate marketing and getting people to Amazon to purchase the same equipment that they're using. But I do like sort of taking back a little bit of that control and knowing that if, even if iTunes crashed or, not that it would, or Overcast disappeared or Spotify disappeared or whatever, there's still a place that people can consume the content.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, if you're doing a hobby podcast, like you might not be wanting to spend a bunch of money a month on a website and on a template, but I think it's been nice. We have used a Show It website the entire time that we've had our podcast, but I worked for Show It and I'm very thankful they gave me a free website. And it would have been I don't know, probably not something we worked into our non-existent budget to pay for a website for our hobby podcast. But it's been nice to know that like we are bringing value and people are listening and we are growing as a podcast. And so I think it's just so perfect and fitting that we have like more of a big boy website to match with our podcast, because I started off with a free template, which was also fantastic. And you can definitely go that route. But purchasing a template that someone has worked on and that has all of these features in it already, game changer. I love it. So I'm so excited about it.
Does Libsyn have a website feature to it?
It's it's a page, you know, it's like
Yeah.
you can click onto it, you can read the blog post type thing that I wrote that goes with that episode. But it's not pretty, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Fireside's the same way. So you can actually kind of build a podcast website off of Fireside.
Okay.
Um, and so for people who are just starting a hobby podcast and just want something that's, so for $19 a month, you get the host, and you can also, this can be your website piece.
Yeah.
It isn't super flexible, but it's, like it'll give you like a mobile responsive website and all of that. But another option for people who, don't want the monthly, hosting fee of another platform, and then to pay for maybe um, a template in addition to that, and then the time it takes to customize that as well.
Right.
Not to say that people shouldn't check it out, but but there's definitely, I think the theme of this, there's definitely more inexpensive ways to go about it.
Absolutely.
And I, from a guy who doesn't really know what he's talking about, I see the value in going that route of actually paying for a design, and that's just a complete novice in all this stuff, and seeing the difference between that website and this website that we're going to be dropping like it's hot.
Absolutely.
And I think long term too, like if you see it's going to grow, or you feel like it's going to grow into something bigger than, just a hobby podcast.
Yeah.
And I think too, setting yourself up for that a little bit, I think going into it with the mindset of, oh, no one's going to listen to this or whatnot, is the wrong mindset to go into it with. Right. So I wouldn't sell yourself short as you get started. But one of the advantages, I think, of going with a website platform like Show It, let's say, and a template is just the search engine optimization perspective of things and the searchability of it. And, if you ever want to move content, let's say, off of Fireside or a tool that's similar, it's going to be more difficult once you have 100 episodes than if you were to have just started with something like Show It to begin with. And Show It's not super expensive either. You're probably looking at somewhere in the ballpark of $24 a month for a plan with a blog, and you would want one with a blog just because that's how you're going to produce your show notes, right? Again, all of these things add up. But even if you were to, I would prioritize that over, let's say that, something like Fusebox I was talking about earlier, that gets you the fancy podcast player, or, one of the more expensive mics even, or how you record your episode. So of all the things that you can pay for, and of course I'm a little bit biased, but kind of where your content lives to me is something that I've always wanted to have as much control over that as possible. And like I said, just one of the things that has been a struggle for me in podcasting was it seems like it's very much a process controlled by Apple, let's say.
Absolutely.
So, and understanding metrics, like Fireside actually has some of the better metrics on episodes that I've seen. Apple, I think in Apple Connect, has started rolling out more robust metrics, that will give you a little bit more insight into how people are interacting with each of your episodes. But for a long time, it was very much like Apple told you the bare minimum. So it's not like having a website where you can go into Google Analytics and you have way too much information where it's like overwhelming to look at. So yeah, I mean, pick and choose, I guess, what you want to invest in. But I always try to choose an infrastructure where I'll be able to grow into a little bit. And I think having, sort of a third party website that's an actual website platform, that's what that's what it's meant to do, is probably a good direction.
Yep. Love it. All right. Well, I feel like we dropped a ton of info on people. We will have basically everything that we mentioned in our show notes. It's going to take me a hot second to write up. Yeah. Do you have a good word of the day for our listeners, Davey?
Yes. So something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially in this pandemic season, and sort of the uncertainty around it. And I was thinking about it in the context of marketing. I feel like I think about a lot of things in the context of marketing. But I remember I was we were doing some training, and I was talking about Facebook ads and landing pages and, all these different things. And one of the things that I typically tell people about um, Facebook ads and landing pages and marketing in general is to really focus on whatever the next step is, and I find that to be a valuable piece of advice for me, something that I've had to remind myself of just in life in general in this season. Um, so what I mean in a marketing context is often people try to make an entire pitch or sell a product or sell a service all in, one instance. They're trying to do too much.
Right.
It's like you meet somebody for the first time, and in the middle of the handshake, you're like, please, buy my product, right?
Right.
And there's a certain nurturing process. And so whenever we're talking about kind of a marketing funnel, we're always talking about, okay, what's the next step you want people to take? So for Facebook ads, you want them to click on this ad. They don't need to buy your product from this ad. They need to click on this ad, land on a landing page, and then, what's the next step from there?
Right.
And what I find in life is that I am at my worst when when I do that thing where I'm like, okay, well, I wonder what next week's going to look like. Maybe, this is going to happen. And then I go from there, and it's like, and all of a sudden I'm dreaming or having a nightmare 6 months out, of things that may or probably will never happen,
Right.
but I've just played out the scenario in my head. And so that's where I find I'm at my worst, where I'm kind of making decisions based on fears, of things that could happen, different anxieties, as opposed to focusing on the next step. So getting up in the morning and saying, okay, what is it today that I need to focus on? What is it right now I need to focus on? So getting up, doing a quiet time, getting some work done before Jack gets up. And then when Jack gets up, it's, actually spending time with Jack, not, and I, again, I have to constantly remind myself of this. So I hope I don't come off as, preaching here, but, not being on Twitter, seeing what's happening in the world, what's happening with this pandemic, vaccine or no vaccine, lockdown or no lockdown, right? It's, hey, I need to make Jack breakfast right now, and I need to spend some time with him. And that's where I find I'm at my best. So I hope that's helpful for somebody, maybe even on just a marketing level, but hopefully on a life level as well.
I love it. Focus on the next step. That's good.
Yeah. So
Well,
something simple, but something I constantly have to remind myself about.
Love it.
yeah, absolutely. And I do think that, like you said, it's so easy to spiral into like, oh, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? And it's the same with like launching a podcast. Ooh, I don't have this. I don't have this. I don't have this. And I don't have this. So I guess I can't even start. And a book that I loved was called Finish by John Acuff. And I'm a constant starter, and I'm an anti-finisher. And for me, that was like a big thing where I was like, okay, I can focus on this one next step, and I can do this next thing. So I think we have lived that a lot, and it's the same thing. If you're focusing too much on like the la la land stuff over here, like it's not only causes you anxiety, but it does rob you of what is actually in front of you. And so Jack is he 2 now or still 1?
He will be 2 next week.
Oh my goodness. Happy birthday.
Yeah.
He's the cutest.
Thanks.
He has the most intense eyes I've ever seen. I feel like he's staring at my soul through the picture that you guys posted. He's so cute. But man, thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you.
And your expertise, and just the gift that you and Krista are to the world, the creative world, and to us too.
Well, we really appreciate that, and I've enjoyed so many conversations with you all, even outside of marketing. We got to talk about fostering a little bit at the last United, something that Chris and I are still interested in. As you all know, we're living with my dad right now in Annapolis while our house is being built. So we're excited to move into a season of life where we could potentially explore that a little bit more.
Oh yeah.
And I'm just grateful that you all had me on. I hope that somebody found some of this valuable. And I want to say too, like, one of the great things about having a podcast is getting to meet people, and getting to build relationships with people who you just think are doing interesting things, and you get to talk to them a little bit more about it. So definitely, I think relationships are a reason for starting a podcast, and I appreciate you all having me on yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Davey.